Okay, some requests have come in, and I feel that the one that is going to be the most beneficial for a more in-depth video is going to be the process of UV unwrapping. I think that it's more of just a scary, uncomfortable thing that you experience immediately in your first like envisioning of what your UVs are. However, that I think once I show you that that is nothing to be worried about, or at least I hope, the rest is a lot easier to grasp once you understand, I think, theoretically what's happening. And that's the part that I think is the hardest to really appreciate, because once you've done that, it's just a matter of knowing where the buttons are, and all of that's going to be documented here. Let's start with the setup. How to get our like document or scene ready, and this is for Maya, to get ready to edit our UVs. Okay. All right. So there is a way that you can just go ahead and go up to where it says UV, and then you click UV and the UV window pops up. I don't love this for a few reasons, because it becomes kind of in the way. It's a floated window. Yes, you can dock it, but I've actually noticed that when I start to navigate in other parts of Maya, docking it just manually starts to play around with how things behave. And it just drives me crazy. So I do it this way. What I will do is I will head over here to this double viewport here, and then click on the right panels, panel, and then at the very bottom, UV editor. That will pop up the actual UV editor on the right, and they're already docked in like a dual window setup. All right. Then you'll want to make sure that you have access to your UV toolkit. That's the next thing. The UV toolkit is found under Tools, and then here you can either show or hide the UV toolkit. It's toggleable though. So if it's already visible, it'll say hide. And if it's not yet visible, it'll say show UV toolkit. So just click on that right on top. Okay. Now what we have here is two editors now. On the left, you'll have a 3D viewport, likely the front view, but if you toggled it over to the perspective view, it'll look something like this. And on the right, we have a 2D visualization of our same object that we have selected. It's a 2D representation. Now they are related. As you select one, so does it select on the other. And when we're using our like transforms, they behave differently. A scale in the 3D editor is going to literally scale the geometry, whereas a scale in the UV editor will scale the UVs. So one edits only the UVs, the other edits the geometry, though they're linked. They're very closely linked. Okay. Stop. Now we want to take a closer look at the UV grid. This is what happens if you zoom out a bit, and you'll notice that a tiling begins to happen. You have the U and the V editor, or the axes. And what we want to do, and you'll notice that pretty much any generated UVs that happen from a primitive like this are going to exist in 0 to 1 on the U and the V axes. This is really important. We want to make sure, at least for now, that we're not editing our UVs or creating our UV maps outside of this 0 to 1 space. What we're creating is something called a coordinate map. It's the UV coordinates where they exist on a grid, on an axis. And if you go outside of that window, it starts to exit out of the file space that's going to be used for our texture maps. There is a case for when we would use tiling textures, but for the props that we're building right now, our single unique assets, we're not going to be using tiling materials right now. That'll change as I show you more complicated geometry. But for now, this is what we're going to do. We're going to keep everything in 0 to 1. Okay, that's this space right here, zoomed in. It gets a little tricky to see. I've found, though, that if you turn on the checker map here, the checker pattern, it'll show all of the how many times that your objects are tiling. And so sometimes I'll use that to kind of help me visualize where 0 to 1 is on the map. Okay. Now you'll notice here too, in the UV toolkit, you can change your sub-selection type. Verts, edges, and faces. It is very similar to the 3D editor with a few added, including the UV selection tool, which is also very helpful. Okay, so that was the vert. This is what an edge looks like. And this is when you happens when you select faces. They are related. Okay. Okay, now for transforms. When you move when you move a UV, it does not move the geometry. It only moves the UV coordinate. Same thing with rotation and scale. However, if you used it on the left, you know that it would actually transform the geometry. This is the UV toolkit. I'm going to highlight the three major sections of it that we're going to care about here. It's going to be the create section, the cut and sew section, and the unfold section. Those are going to be what we'll be interacting with the most as we kind of get a handle on how to UV unwrap. Okay, so over here in Maya, this is live now, no more slide presentation. I have for you a set of random primitives. If you can unwrap a primitive, I believe you can unwrap almost anything. If you really look at anything carefully, you can see that most objects feel like embellished primitives. A cell phone is kind of a very nice cube. A barrel is a nice cylinder. And as we even kind of go into organic form, you'll notice that there will be like base form that, like my hands are complicated. Hands are super complicated. Look at this. Look at this. Hand, complicated. Super. But really, they're embellished cylinders, fancy cylinders, a very fancy cube or box for the blocking of my palm. Give or take an edge. But the way I think about the more complex forms is really just kind of breaking them down into primitives and then unwrapping or solving those problems kind of one by one, step by step. And we're just going to look at just regular basic primitives for now. Yeah, this one. Okay. Okay, so let's start with the setup. First, I'll head over here to my dual monitor. I really prefer to build the perspective on the left and the UV editor itself on the right. And that's because that's like the default setup in like Substance Painter, which I think I use most of the time when I'm making materials. So it's really just a matter of keeping me from having to context switch between the two. All right. So now that I have these 5 primitives here, and let's pretend, you know what, I'm actually going to kind of take this a step further, and this is going to be a metaphor for a complex material, a complex object. And this is all one object now, what I've done there. And I think that when you first open the UV editor, this is something that you'll usually see, or maybe you see some real spiderwebby mess that's just like kind of terrifying. Like, oh God, what have I done with all of the editing I've done? And honestly, the more like complex that your builds are, the more bananas these are. Oh yeah, that's good. Ooh, yes. Okay. All right. I did what I could to make just a disgusting mess of UVs. Now, the UVs that I had before, and this monstrosity, are not actually more or less work for me if we follow these very specific steps. And I have to say that the steps themselves are a little fluid in themselves. They don't work always explicitly in order or always correctly, right? You know, if you have to redo a step, it doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. Okay, so what are those? Let's cover that real quick. Okay, UV unwrapping, the steps. Step 1, we create them. Now, this might get a little confusing because don't they already exist? They do, but usually they exist in a context that's not really helpful to us. It's possible that maybe what you see, you make sense. It's a simple enough form, depending on what you're modeling. But the more complex your 3D asset gets, it becomes like really hard to understand what's going on. So whenever you find yourself just kind of stuck and not knowing what to do with a piece, we can just go back to creating UVs using UV projection. And that's going to be step 1 pretty much anytime. So that means whether you have a spider webby mess of UVs or very tight, nicely created, and you just want to redo something, this is going to be the same amount of work. It's the same amount of work to create. Okay. Step 2, we need to identify the shells. Now, if you're a Blender user out there, this is going to be islands for you. I believe that's what Blender uses or calls them. Shells are eventually the same thing. They're going to be the chunk of UV that is going to be eventually laid out in your UV coordinate map. Identifying the shells isn't even really like a tangible step that you do with your buttons. This is more of something that you do in your mind. You're looking at the asset, you're deciding what you want your shells to be, and then you move forward with action by using a cut or sew approach. The UVs are created, you can see them, you can imagine or envision what you would like a shell to be. And so usually this is where we start making cuts along our UVs, and then sectioning them off into what we eventually will make full shells. But before we can lay them out, we have to unfold them. And this is kind of like it's not really a metaphor. It's quite literally what we're doing. But if you can imagine for a moment, if your UVs are a little gnarly, but the cuts have been made and they will behave, and we'll talk about what that means. Imagine that your UVs are kind of like a bunched up blanket. And if you were to take that blanket and just give it a shake, like you'd put it on your bed, that is what unfold kind of does for you. It does a lot more than that, but that is basically what it's doing for you. Then, once you've had all of your UVs gone through that process and we've unfolded them all and they're all scaled to an appropriate, size, this is the part of the process that is a layout. We lay out each piece on the 0 to 1 space of your UV coordinate. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we do any of that? Okay, so we're back to this mess. Step 1, let's create some UVs that make some sense to us. All right, so let's head on over to our tools, show UV toolkit. There's going to be our home row right here. This is going to be what's going to, I think, be the most, this is going to be our most important UI during this process. And I'm going to start by selecting all of my objects here. Now, this is a sub-selection, mind you. I'm not selecting them in the object mode, although I can start to interact if I just select a sub-selection here. In most cases, I work in the face selection with toggling to the edge selection for my cuts and sews. But for now, I'm going to just stick with faces. I'm going to head over to create, and you'll see that I have a handful of UV projection options. Automatic is going to be the most straightforward and frankly least pretty, arguably least optimal. There is a lot of sort of negative space in this UV editor, and what I personally don't like about this is that it has a lot of seams. You can see here that there's a lot of spaces where you could have potential errors in your materials. But if you're using something like Substance Painter, you can actually probably get away with it in most cases here. What I don't like about this though is that I don't think that it does a very good job of I don't know, the space. I don't feel like it does. It's not bad. It's not bad, but I like to keep things a little bit more organized. So I'm going to show you how to do this manually. This is also a good practice to do manually because sometimes these automatic unwraps are just not really going to cut it at the end of the day. And you have to be able to do the changes that you need for whatever specific problem might come up. All right. Okay, so the very first thing here is that I got this big nasty N-gon from the cone mesh here. And even though it's letting me, I don't want it. So I'm going to actually show you something that I think is really important to understand about the editors. These are related, but these are not, they don't behave the same. Okay. So I'm going to select this face here, and in the UV editor, I'm going to delete it. And you'll notice that something changed on the left, but it's not like the geometry isn't there. It's there. I deleted the UVs. So I've got this flat gray tone that's essentially just like a single pixel of it being rendered and everything is just existing in black. And that's not what we want. We don't want that. But if I wanted to maybe delete a problem piece of geometry, all I have to do is just like make sure that I activate the 3D editor and hit delete there. And then it actually removes that geometry. Like that's actually gone now. You can see very clearly gone. Now I do want this like a geometry to exist, but I'm going to go ahead and just, inset or, extrude inward, however you want to call that. I'll merge to center. And you'll notice too, it made geometry in the UV editor. It sure did, but it's not great. Right here, I have like all of this geometry that's on top of itself. Here, let's turn on the checker pattern and you can really see how it's literally just repeating the same pattern all the way around. And that's not ideal. If I were to hit automatic on that, that does kind of solve it. And I could just kind of bring it back down. But I don't love the automatic tool because it's, it takes control away from me. And I think that's my biggest problem. All right. Well, all right. So I at least understand how the automatic UVs work. Okay. Don't panic. They just don't have UVs. They're still there. I'm going to now try a different projection that I think is going to make a little bit more sense. And that's the planar projection. If I hit left mouse click, you'll notice that it like took a snapshot and it stretched them funky, very funky. And I think the first question I get from anybody is, why is it stretching like that? And that's because it's trying to fit the projection that it made from 0 to 1 and fill that space. It's not ideal, but if I were to shrink this down so that this matches a little bit more accurately what's happening over here, you'll notice that these squares look a little bit more checker patterny and less, I don't know, the Beetlejuice stripes. And I'm going to shrink that down, and that makes some sense, right? Because this is a slightly more accurate representation in 2D of its 3D version. Right? But there's a problem. We've got some stretching on the sides and stretching on the top. And so what it's doing is it's actually taking a picture, a projection, a flat projection from a specific angle. And in this case, it's going to be from the side view. That's what it's doing. It's taking like a camera projection and coming right at it from an orthographic lens and saying, snap that. They're just going to apply a checker pattern across this guy. And if I were to make this, I don't know, smaller, you can actually kind of see the checker pattern, like as though it was just slapped right on it on a planar. Okay, not ideal, but the positive of using the planar projection in any form really is that it gives me context. I no longer have like a spiderwebby mess. I have like individual pieces that I can go and edit. I'm going to start with this torus guy, this guy right here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and planar project it again, and you'll notice that it fills up the whole space. I like to move things out of the way and then work in the 0 to 1 coordinate space of the UV editor, but this is not an ideal projection direction, I'd say. I can turn on the checker pattern here. Ooh, boop, there we go. You can see it. It's right there. That's kind of cool. I would rather actually, I think, project it from a different direction. And you can do that by clicking the planar. The left is from the side view. That is the X axis. Middle mouse click is the Y axis. That would be the top view. And the right mouse click of this is going to be the Z axis, and that's the front view. And you can see that I can just kind of toggle. Here, I'll go in perspective view of this now, and you can really see this in action. Left, middle, right mouse click. I don't usually remember them, so I just like toggle until I get the one that I want. And in this case, I want the Y axis. Why? I think because when I'm imagining my shells, I'm thinking about this as like two donut sides. I'd like a top and a bottom. Like I'd like to just kind of like crack them open, flip one, and then flatten them, or at least unfold them that way. I think it'll work nicely. So that's why I went ahead and just did a projection from the top. And now I'm going to select through edges to make cuts or sewing. Now I'm going to start with just clicking, double clicking on this edge loop here. And this is where I want my cut to be, right? So I'm going to head down to, now that I've created, to cut and sew. And I'm going to click cut. I'm going to move back to my face selection type. All right. Now, hey now. Good. Oh. Oh, no wonder. Forgot to cut the inside. All right, that makes a lot more sense now. Move that over here, move that over here. Okay. I'm gonna shrink them down and put them right here. And I think if I were to put these right next to each other, we could see the checker pattern behaving pretty decently. Sure. Now, if I look at the bottom side though, notice something funky kind of happening. This is actually inverted, which makes sense because I took a snapshot from one direction and that meant that it was right on top of itself. So that means the bottom side is actually flipped. Now, in the UV editor, you can actually use a visual tool here that will show you when a shell is inverted. And I'm going to show you, like I'm turning this on right now. I use it pretty regularly. Most of the time I don't want them inverted. Sometimes it's fine though. Just know that that's what's happening if that's what you want to do. But while I have both of these selected now, I've visualized what I want my shell to be. I've made my cuts. And now what's left is I have to unfold it. That's like taking a sheet and going to it. So if I head down to the unfold section here and I click literally unfold, it relaxes a lot of the stretching that was occurring to the shell and also flips the one that was a problem. So that can often happen. Sometimes though, Maya does struggle a little bit with like trying to unfold it and it gets funky. If that happens, all you gotta do is just kind of take that problem child back to square one. We can just apply another projection to it. That'll usually fix it. And then make a quick unfold and then that'll work. Okay. So now I've got these pieces here that to me feel pretty good. Gonna shrink this guy down a little bit. I'll worry about the size and scale of them later when I'm at the layout section, but those are pretty nice. Like I don't have, 4 pieces for this guy anymore, which I think that is what an automatic unwrap would do. I'm curious, so I'm actually going to just do this over here. I'm going to apply automatic to that guy so that we can see its look here. And like, if you look at this, it's all over the place. It's separated into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How many? 10 pieces for this one thing. Or if I did it myself, 2. That greatly reduces seams and potentially problems. I like this. I feel like too, when I use my light bakes, that there's less like bleeding that could happen that I see. I'll sometimes see the visual and it just drives me crazy. So, all right. So that's for me for making the case to not just use the automatic all the time. Okay. All right. I'm going to hide that guy. And come back over here. All right. So I've done the torus. Next up, let's go ahead and look at our cone shape here. Now, I'm just looking at this guy, and right now, all I want to do is imagine where I could see my cuts. I think for sure this guy on the bottom can be a shell, and this guy on top can be maybe 2 shells or 1 with maybe a couple of slices. So I'm going to just start by making the one decision. I've got this cut, this edge selected. I'm going to click cut, and now I've separated the 2. Now, this helps me kind of just like think about them a piece at a time. This is a circle. Pretty easy to do, I think. Middle mouse click that to project it from the top. click unfold. Now, if we just hit the planar projection, it's possible that an unfold here will work. Sometimes it doesn't though. You'll notice that when I hit unfold here, it like disappears to nothing. Yeah, it's just gray. What does that look like with the checker pattern on? Yeah, it's oh, it's stretched. Oh, it's bad. It's not good. Okay, so, well, that's okay. That's okay. Let's bring this back here to kind of center normal. I'm going to go ahead and make that cut again and move the top out of the way. And this guy, I'm going to create again, but this time from the top projection instead of the side, so that when I do the unfold, it kind of understands what it needs to do. It's closer to its original form, so it saved it pretty well. I like that. Now, we know that we need to create, decide on what we want our shells to be, make cuts or sewing. We unfold, and then we lay it out. Now, what if, though, we make a decision that we're not happy with? That is not the end of the world. Let's just go ahead and skip a step here. I'm not going to really think about a shell. I'm just going to unfold it and hope for the best. Now, this is okay. It is technically working, but you'll notice that there is some funky stretching here, and that's maybe not great. If this is the only perspective that you would see your cone, then it's, I guess, fine. But you'll notice how it distorts that texture map, and that stretching will occur in its texture, in its material later. So, oh no, I messed up. It does not mean you have to start completely over. You don't have to start over with everything. You don't even really need to start over with this single piece. You can just start with this guy. Well, okay, made a decision. I thought I wanted this to be my shell. I've decided maybe not. I'm instead going to make a cut down the side and see if that helps. So I will make a cut, and then I will go ahead and just this section, let's turn off that awful checker pattern so you can see. I'll hit unfold again, and that's looking something that's a little bit more representative of what your cone shape is. Now, if I turn on the checker pattern, the stretching, it still exists, but it's much better. A lot less of a stress on the material. I'm going to shrink that down, and let's take a closer look at this guy. Now, what if I was looking at this from a front view and, oh, maybe I don't like this particular cut I made. What if I would rather the cuts be on the side views? Well, that's okay. I can go ahead and make a cut here, break this up into a few sections, and now we've got something of a puzzle piece that we can work with. When I'm making decisions like this, it helps me to look at the asset in the 3D editor, because here I can kind of get context for what it is. Like, I've already sort of lost track of which edge is which, right? And I know that I wanted the front and the back to be together, so that means these guys are the ones I want separate. So I'm going to select the edge that I actually want to sew and then put them back together. And if I go to the cut and sew section, and here, let me close create, and I'm going to close unfold, and we're just going to look at cut and sew right here. I can use literally sew, which does this. Okay, it did make it a shell that desperately needs to be unfolded. That would work. And now I've got a shell that I'm less ashamed of. However, this guy here, this edge, I'm going to show you a slightly different approach that is one of my favorites, because it lets me skip the step of unfolding if the shapes of the shells are close enough. Because if I hit stitch together instead, it moves one shell to the other with very little stretching. Sometimes, like, this isn't always ideal, but like if I were working on something that's a slightly different scale, you'll notice that what'll happen is that one will match the other. So that's just be ready for that. And it doesn't always behave maybe kind of how you want, but for the most part, stitch together is my preferred over sew, but they both work fine. They both work fine, especially if you just remember, make sure that you are doing that real quick unfold. All right, so that's nice. That's nice. They look like pretty fans right next to each other like that. All right, so those are over there. Next up, the cylinder. Man, unwrapping a cylinder, you're gonna be doing this a lot. Cylinders show up a lot, and unwrapping them it's really not as scary as you'd think. You bet that we can go ahead and do the same sort of process with the planar projections. We can just make a planar projection, decide what we want our shells to be, and the way I'm envisioning it is maybe one on the top and one on the bottom. So if I were to make a cut here, I'll hit cut, face selection, this middle chunk out of the way. These guys are a problem. I can try unfolding. Did not work. I knew that might happen. So instead of it, like, me just kind of calling the quits here, I'm going to head over to planar again. I'm going to project from the top so that we've got the pizza slice. And here is where I'll go ahead and do a quick unfold. Right? And now I've got a top and a bottom, and I'm about to have something for this guy here. I'm looking at this as like, think of this as like a forever scarf. You know how, I don't know if you have forever scarves, but wherever you are, I don't know. It's a scarf that's sewed together so that it's an infinity scarf, also called that, where it's something you wear. It keeps you very warm in the winter, but you can't like unfold it completely. It's always stitched together and it's always a circle. So if I were to unfold this, will you let me? I mean, it technically worked, but that's not exactly the results that I want for that. So I'm gonna turn that off. Oh no, what do I do? I messed up. Well, it's not the end of the world. Because again, if you make a decision that you were unhappy about, it's not like you're totally screwed here. We know that we just like need to work on the shell a little bit. And in this case, with the stretching, it looks like we'll gonna have to make at least one cut so that it's not stuck together on itself. I'm gonna do it from the back because historically that has kind of been the least conspicuous location for a seam. I'll hit cut and then I will unfold that section. And now turn this on. Hopefully you'll see what looks like a pretty reasonable unwrap of the side. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now, these are obviously kind of big, so I'll select them both and shrink them down a little bit so that at least, they're not taking up so much space here. But hold on though, Renee. I noticed that there's a cylindrical projection to create here. There is. And this guy is actually really handy when you have a cylinder. I'm going to actually take a look at just a single cylinder for just a moment so that we can look at what the cylindrical projection will do. Now, this is not perfect. You're actually kind of really close to having an unwrap here. If we were to just kind of stretch this guy out to be the shape of the checker pattern, we're basically done. But let's pretend that we constructed this from nothing and we've got spider webby on UVs. Well, I'm going to take this cylinder and I'm going to apply a cylindrical projection. And you'll notice that in my 3D editor, I have the kind of UV projection on top of it, on the mesh itself. You could see the gizmo kind of wrapping around it. And yeah, the tops are a problem, but the cylinder itself is near perfect. Near perfect. And what I mean by that, I mean like mathematically near perfect. These edges are perfectly straight, and that is friendly to how you might do the materials. And some of us will want that in our future, for future us. If this is you in this case, what I recommend is doing a cylindrical projection, shaping the face of the cylinder here, right here, the side of the cylinder to be approximately the correct scaled resolution so that we have at least a checker pattern that looks squared instead of rectangular in its checker. And then we'll go ahead and make some cuts again around the top and the bottom again. And what you can do is we can just use this as its piece rather than having to do an unwrap, like fully unwrap. And then again, the planar projection on top and bottom and a quick unfold. Now, this is pretty cool. Sometimes though, you might have a kind of embellishment or detail on your mesh that can't go overlooked at this with the simple process of a cylindrical nap. And let me show you what I mean. If I were to add a few edge loops here, add one here, face select, extrude out real quick, or in for that matter, you'll notice that it doesn't really account for this edge on the inside. And we would really like to keep the cylinder totally perfect, as well as close to perfect as we can. That would mean that instead of just going over here and doing an unfold, where you can see that it's going to kind of make this a little bit more organic and it's unfolding it on both axes, we can instead ask it to unfold along the V axis. I think of V as in vertical because that's actually how I want to pull it. I want to just like whoosh, that direction. U is not short for horizontal. It is just the other axes, but V for vertical helps me remember that. So I'm going to go ahead and click unfold along V, and you'll notice that it kept my edges mostly straight, but then giving me a little bit of room here for this checker pattern to not be stretched on this detail. That is going to come in handy as you have more details on your mesh that maybe you hadn't thought about before. And that's also like when the unfold option just totally like blows up that kind of machine perfect UV layout. Unfold that way. If you unfold it again, it usually doesn't have as big of like an embellishment on it. Like it doesn't have a big effect on it. But it's still enough for me to notice, and I don't like that, so I like to keep it that way. Okay, so that is the cylindrical unwrap. You'll notice that like both this and this work, right? Like these work. One is not right and the other wrong. They're just different ways to approach the same problem. And you'll notice too that like what it is that the skill that's involved here has to do with looking at the mesh, identifying what you want those shells to be, and then making those cuts, creates, and sews accordingly for that. So I think that if you got to the stage for a cylinder, no matter how you got there, this is great. It doesn't matter if you like it one way versus another. You got to go with your heart, you know? Okay, so I'm gonna just, actually, I think I'll just delete this guy because don't need it. I was just trying to show another way to do it. Okay, now the cube. Cubes are cool. Cubes are great. These are automatic unwraps are not bad if it's a simple cube, because then we can kind of just make some sews to get this, you know, maybe, you know, less. If I look at the front view, it's front right here. And U. Sure. I can click stitch together, and you'll notice that we have a bit of what looks like an Amazon package box. A kind of almost like if you unfolded a cardboard box. Now you can actually, I'll just show you how to do it. If you hold down J while you're rotating, you can actually snap to keep the orientation like to perfect angles. However, if you like kind of eyeball it and you're slightly off and that's kind of driving you crazy, if you head down to the arrange and layout, you can click orient shells. Or not. Usually does it. Huh. How about what if it's orient? Oh, I was clicking orient edges. I meant shells. There we go. It'll reorganize it for you. I wonder though, if I was askew and I had the shells selected and I clicked orient edges, sorry, if I had the edges selected and I hit orient edges, you guys, I go whoop, it kind of does the same thing, but I think it does it on the micro, like each individual angle gets oriented, and if in this case a simple enough form is done, it looks like it orients the whole thing. So hey, that's a thing you can do that also kind of keeps it nice and friendly. Now I think the hardest to do is to think about spheres, because even though like we're obviously trying to get this checker pattern to not stretch, because this is representative of our resolution of what the texture map is going to communicate when it's applied. So like if we created a texture that looked exactly like this and we applied it to our mesh, that's how it would look. And that means if we want wood to look like wood and we create wood, we need it to not stretch on our object. So that means like, what do we do with a cylinder like this or a sphere like this? Well, I just want to say that there's no perfect way about this. There's always going to be some amount of stretching. And that's just going to have to be acceptable to a point. But I'll show you how I usually go about it. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the spherical projection so that you can see what it does. It's not ideal. But if you were to hit spherical and then hit unfold, you have a pretty decent, like, kind of mold of what you'd say like maybe a planet Earth might look like. I don't actually ever do this. Is that wrong? I don't think so. It's not wrong. I could come in here maybe and make some cuts, and maybe make some sews, sure, and then do the same down here so that I at least have what feels like a sense of order to this. Let's sew, and then we can unfold this again, and it's not actually going to change much. It gives it kind of a nice bubbly symmetry, I suppose, but this is not for me, really. It still stretches and I don't love it. So what do you do, Renee? Well, I mean, I kind of just like go back to the planar projection. I'll usually project from the vertical axis, which is the Y, and that's middle mouse click. I'll select the center, or if depending on what's looking, because if it's an eyeball, I usually orient this this like point where it comes to as like the iris, and so this is a great place to unwrap that. If I'm making a ball that is oriented for this to be facing front, I might do it around the side here, but I basically just kind of cut it in half. And here, let me turn this off so you can really see me make these cuts. And I will hit cut, and then I will go ahead and hit unfold. And to me, I actually feel a little bit better about something like this, even though it's not perfect. This too is going to have kind of its own stretching, but I feel like this is something that I could work with in terms of a seam, rather than the pulling happening. I mean, there's always going to be a little bit, right? But that's kind of how I go about this. And finally, the layout phase. Well, I've gotten all these things unfolded and unwrapped, and they're existing in a way that I like. And if I turn on the checker pattern, I'll actually notice that some checker patterns are tinier than others. Well, usually if they're too small, it means the resolution is very high and you've got something that's like a little too big on the actual map itself. So what I tend to do when I'm doing this manually anyway, is that I'll like try to get them all to match each other close enough. I think this guy is also going to have to come down a little bit. Just okay. This is looking better. And these are, at least they're all kind of looking like they exist sort of in the same scale. Okay. And then I will start to move them into the 0 to 1 space. Now, pieces of advice of doing this manually. I usually like to start with the biggest pieces first and bring them in, because then I could usually like maneuver the smaller pieces a little bit nicer or a little bit tighter. And you know, I'm a little bit particular about how I like to put the stuff in. I like to keep them organized. I like to I don't know. Like it's not it's not wildly important that they're in a specific order. It's just mostly, I think it's just how I've always done it, because I didn't always have the most powerful tools to edit with. And so I found myself just kind of, doing myself a favor for future me. And like this is already not gonna fit quite perfectly, so I'm gonna just like shrink this down just a little bit. Put it over here. Yeah. So this is probably the most tedious part of all of this. And I know there are probably some of you who are like, why are you doing it that way? Why don't you just use the layout? Like, I'm gonna use the layout in a moment, but I just wanted to show you kind of what happens if you have a little bit of control and agency over this versus, say, the automatic stuff. Now I'm gonna make another copy here. I've got 3 sets now. I've got the automatic unwrap, the manual unwrap, and the manual, the manual unwrap, where we use an automatic layout. Now, I think this is gonna kind of show you some rules here. I'm gonna turn on the checker pattern for all of them so that you can kind of see what's happening here. I feel like, these guys over here have the most opportunity for potential issues with regards to seams. And it's okay. A little stretching happening too. You can fix some of that with a simple unfold and then redo the layout. Unfold, redo layout. And that'll help with it. But I don't love losing the control of it. However, this will work. This will work fine. Okay. Manual control, tidier. I just like to know where everything is. I like where they are. I know where they are. And I actually have a little bit more room here that if I wanted to, I could kind of play around with resolution on some of these assets. Like some of them can take up more or less. Arguably here though, I think in this case, the automatic unwrap is actually taking up more UV space. So technically you get a nicer resolution. And as long as you're careful with that in your material editing part, you can actually like take care of that with a decent, projection of the material. So, okay. And that's the manual, and this is the automatic unwrap. I don't like how it kind of just takes everything and to me kind of jumbles them together, but it still also works. And as long as we don't have, a few things are not happening. When we don't have any stretching occurring in a way that we're not happy with or that we can't live with. And also that we do not have any objects on top of each other, right? So that this material is overlapping, and so what's painted here will show up on all of them. There are use cases for that. This is not one of them when we're looking at kind of prop building or the creation of unique assets. We want them to be taking up all the UV space here. Now, there are times where it makes sense to do it. Just this is not it. Okay. All right. Yay. So that is a kind of a breakdown of how to UV unwrap and how to approach this with some kind of fundamental steps of understanding. There really is no way of getting better at this that isn't just doing it a lot. You'll develop your own sort of philosophy. If, automatic unwrap is doing it for you, go for it. As long as you're getting the results that you want out of your materials. Okay. All right. Well, I hope this helps. Let me know if you have any other questions.